So here we are. This is the first lecture in Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is on fiscal policy. And instead of me reading to you from the Wall Street, I've got just a short video on a topic that I think is very important. And that's about Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank is located in Germany, but it's not strictly a German bank, but it's one of the largest banks in the world. In terms of the derivatives market, it's got perhaps the largest presence, and it's got a lot of, well, it's on shaky grounds. And some people believe that it's on the verge of collapse, and if it does, it will be similar to when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt back in 2007 or so. Lehman Brothers was an investment bank, a very large one, and it went bankrupt, and we did not bail it out. And a lot of people look at that as the real catalyst that led to the total financial collapse of 2007-2008. So anyway, this is just a short, 5 minutes here, and then I have another video on Keynesian versus Austrians. But let's look at this, and maybe you'll have some questions about this. This is the current stuff.
Thanks for having me again.
Hey, thanks for being here. Let's just start off with Deutsche Bank. And you wrote an article that Deutsche Bank is on the verge of collapse, and we see the Department of Justice, they're demanding a $14 billion fine going all the way back to 2008 for the mortgage-backed securities. What is happening with Deutsche Bank? Do you think this is gonna be it?
Well, I do. I've been writing this since June when I wrote an article called Deutsche Bank, the Lehman of Europe is on the verge of collapse. And I believe it more than ever. In fact, it's kind of, I think what I wrote the other day was that all the major bankruptcies I've seen in my career, going back to Enron and WorldCom, Fannie Mae, Bear Stearns, Lehman, nothing really compares to the level of fraud and politics and deceit and unknowns about what's going on with this company with the largest derivatives book in the world, the largest bank in Europe. We talked about the Department of Justice. It's really, actually yesterday's article, 2 days ago, was called, Mark this date, war has started. And I'm talking about the way that the whole Deutsche Bank collapse has come together in the last few days, or the last few weeks, starting with, really goes back to the European Union, which simply needed cash, in my opinion, fining Apple $14 billion because they know they got it, and say, hey, you evaded taxes. I mean, true, it was our rules that caused you to do it, but give us $14 billion. So the United States retaliates against the weakest company in Europe, as opposed to Apple, which is the strongest company here, for the same amount. And you're talking about that these are a scam that's going back to 2007 or 8. Well, you think Deutsche Bank's the only company they're investigating for this? Why did they pick this particular company, which they already know? Look, it was the IMF, which is led by the United States, which called it the most systematically dangerous institution in the world only 2 months ago. And yet we're going after this company knowing full well that they don't have $14 billion. So, it's kind of, it's even for me, who's a kind of a fact guy, and I don't really like conspiracies, to think that there's something really ugly going on behind the scenes here. But the fact is, we were within hours of the system imploding on Friday. It's amazing how the market manipulation of the past couple of trading days has made people forget that Friday morning we woke up with Deutsche Bank in free fall under $10 a share in Europe, and probably the markets wouldn't have opened up on Monday if Friday continued just as Thursday had ended. And they create this ridiculous rumor, which is, it's been refuted already. They're about to. They say on Twitter, they say the French press says that the Deutsche Bank's about to settle with the government of the U.S. for $5.4 billion. When we learn later on that they haven't even spoken to the U.S. government yet, so it's a complete lie. And on top of that, every Wall Street bank, when they announced the fine 2 weeks ago, as was saying, got $3 or $4 billion would kill Deutsche Bank, and yet everyone's supposedly excited that it's going to be $5.5 billion. It's it just boggles the mind what's going on. But the fact is, they saved themselves for, I don't know, today's article is called the Deutsche Bank destruction, how long did it buy them? Well, what did they save themselves for? A couple of weeks, days, until the next shoe falls? I mean, God, this weekend, the government of Italy joined in by suing Deutsche Bank and accusing them of being the reason why their own third biggest bank, Montepaschi, is about to go bankrupt. So, I mean, it's pretty sinister. And again, with Deutsche Bank being the biggest derivatives holder in the world and just being party to so many debts that are about to get really bad, it's really amazing how much damage it could be done. Remember, S&P, Standard & Poor's, it was only a few months ago, I think it was May or June, where they downgraded their outlook from stable to negative. They still have an investment grade rating. I mean, at what point, how much more is it going to take for Deutsche Bank to not be an investment grade rating? So I don't believe it's going to last through the fall. I haven't thought that all year. And I think, that it's a big reason why what I called yesterday's attack on precious metals, the Deutsche Bank destruction, what I call a named storm attack, where they just blatantly, violently attack precious metals for absolutely no reason other than some kind of fear. And there's really no other reason to describe it. And I think if you look at Occam's razor, the Deutsche Bank implosion is right on the top of the list of near-term potential, catastrophic events.
We've been talking about this for a long time, that, Deutsche.
Well, that's just to kind of keep you abreast of, what's happening in the world. Two things about that. The $14 million that he's referring to is a fine that the U.S. government has imposed on Deutsche Bank for transgressions going back to 2007, 2008, during the financial crisis. And the bottom line is that Deutsche Bank is suffering even without having to pay that fine. And if it does, then it collapse is inevitable. So anyway, that's just something that you want to be aware of. And the other thing is, he didn't get into it, but back in 2009, 2010, we did have a banking collapse worldwide, and many of the banks were bailed out. In fact, Lehman Brothers was the only one that was not bailed out. The next time it happens, there's a consensus that we will have a bail-in rather than a bailout of banks. And what a bail-in is, well, a bailout, first of all, is when the government simply takes taxpayers' money and gives it to the banks. That's called a bailout. Well, a bail-in is when banks take funds from depositors. And that has happened several times, in the past terms of history. And that's what will probably happen with it, when we have another financial banking collapse. That the banks will simply take a certain percentage of people's deposits. Because see, legally, when you put money in a bank, that money is no longer yours, but that money belongs to the bank. So the bank has legal right to take that money if they choose to do so. Anyway, that's what the bail-in is. Any questions about that? No? Okay, well, I've got a video here. We are moving into an area where there's going to be more history. Up to this point, we've been talking a lot about just the basics. But now, it's kind of like learning a foreign language. You learn the vocabulary, which is not all that interesting, perhaps. You learn the grammar, and then after that, you learn to speak the language, which then it can become more fun. Well, that's kind of like the point we've made here in this course, that we've learned a lot of vocabulary and we've learned a lot of these concepts, but now we're going to start putting these things together and really using these concepts to explain historically and present day how the economy works. So anyway, that's Yeah, let's watch this. I think you're going to enjoy this. Very well done.
Lord Keynes, welcome, sir. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine.
Your agenda.
That won't be necessary. I am the agenda. Tell them I've arrived.
And then tell them I've arrived.
And your name is?
Hayek. F.A. Hayek. Me.
Freddie.
Yeah.
Keynes,
Hey, listen, party at the Fed.
Already.
20 minutes.
Lobby. John Maynard Keynes.
F.A. Hayek.
Yeah, we're opposed.
We oppose each other philosophically.
In the same studio.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it. Play low interest rates.
It's the animal spirit. John Maynard Keynes wrote the book on modern macro. The man you need when the economy's off track. Depression, recession, now your question's in session. Have a seat and I'll school you in one simple lesson. 1929, the big crash. We didn't bounce back, economy's in the trash. Persistent unemployment, the result of sticky wages. Waiting for recovery, that's outrageous. I had a real plan, any fool can understand. The advice real simple, who's aggregate demand? C-I-G, altogether gets to Y. Keep that total growing, watch the economy fly.
We've been going back and forth for a century.
I want to steer markets.
I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it. Play low interest rates.
It's the animal spirit. You see, it's all about spending. Hear the register cha-ching. Circular flow, the dough is everything. So if the throw is getting low, doesn't matter the reason. We need more government spending. Now it's stimulus season, so forget about saving. Get it straight out of your head. Like I said, in the long run, we're all dead. Savings is destruction, that's the paradox of thrift. Don't keep money in your pocket or that growth will never live. Because business is driven by the animal spirits, the bull and the bear. And there's reasons to fear its effects on capital investment, income, and growth. That's why the state should fill the gap with stimulus, both the monetary and the fiscal. They're equally correct. Public works, digging ditches, war has the same effect. Even a broken window helps the glass man have some wealth. The multiplier driving higher the economy's health. And if the central bank's interest rate policy tanks, a liquidity trap, that new money stuck in the banks. Deficits could be the cure you've been looking for. Let the spending soar, now that you know the score. My general theory's made quite an impression. Revolution. I transformed the econ profession. You know me, modesty, still I'm taking the bow. So say it loud and say it proud, we're all Keynesians now.
We've been going back and forth for a century.
I want to steer markets.
I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it.
I made my case, Freddie H. Listen up, can you hear it?
I'll begin in broad strokes, just like my friend Keynes. His theory conceals the mechanics of change. That simple equation, too much aggregation, ignores human action and motivation. Getting Keynes as a justification for bailouts, payoffs by polls with machinations. Provide them with cover to sell us a free lunch. Then all that we're left with is debt and a bunch. If you're living high on that cheap credit hog, don't look for a cure from the hair of the dog. Real savings come first if you want to invest. The market coordinates time with interest. Your focus on spending is pushing on thread. In the long run, my friend, it's your theory that's dead. So sorry there, buddy, if that sounds like an Your so-called stimulus will make things worse. Just more of the same, more incentives perverse. And that credit crunch ain't a liquidity trap. Just a broke banking system. I'm done, that's a wrap. We've been going back and forth for a century.
I want to steer
I
markets.
want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it. Play low interest
No,
rates.
it's the animal spirit. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist.
The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design.
Well, how'd you like that? That was well done, wasn't it? Now, there were several things mentioned in there that we haven't covered yet, but we're going to cover this lecture, actually. We're going to talk about the essence of Keynesian economics. In the video we just saw, he talked about liquidity trap, the paradox of thrift, and things like that. And we're going to talk about these things today, in fact. So let's get to it. This is a slideshow from the beginning. And who were the classical economists? The group in the 18th and 19th centuries, including Adam Smith, known as the father of modern day economics. So you know by now that Adam Smith had a book. He wrote a book, had it published in 1776 called The General Theory, no, I got the wrong book here, The Wealth of Nations. It's called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, but usually we just call it The Wealth of Nations. And in this book, Adam Smith explained how it is that a free market system without any central control seems to give us just those goods and services that we want and at reasonable prices, at least over the long run. And a lot of what we talk about in this course actually goes way back to the Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. And so the economists, we didn't really call them economists back then, but people who studied the economy just before Adam Smith and after Adam Smith as a group, they're called classical economists as a group. Now, Adam Smith, by the way, let me say this, wasn't an original thinker per se, but there were economists, or at least people who studied the economy before Adam Smith that had this idea, and another person had that idea, and Adam Smith was kind of was able to put these ideas together in one comprehensive book, and plus he added some of his own ideas into it, and so that became a major event on the world stage. So what did Adam Smith and the classical economists believe? The economy was always tending toward a full employment equilibrium and stable prices. Now here's one of the most basic concepts in economics, the concept of the equilibrium. An equilibrium doesn't mean that two things are equal. An equilibrium is a tendency toward. Like if you could envision a grandfather clock and there's a pendulum swinging, well, that pendulum ultimately is tending toward the midpoint. It may go off in one direction and then go off in another direction, but ultimately it's tending toward the midpoint. And that midpoint is what's called an equilibrium. It's the point toward which the economy tends. And I'll notice that with that pendulum, half the time the pendulum is moving away from the midpoint. moves in one direction and moves in the other direction, is only at the midpoint a small amount of the time, and yet that midpoint is ultimately where that pendulum is tending toward. And this is the concept of the equilibrium. It's a tendency toward. So when we say that the classical economists believe that full employment and stable prices was an equilibrium, what they meant by that is that things may get better and things may get worse. We may have unemployment, we may have inflation for periods of time, but over time, ultimately, assuming we have a free market, the tendency is toward full employment and stable prices. Now this goes to the heart and core of the difference between Austrian economics and Keynesian economics. Austrians are closer to the classical economists, and they believe that if we have a free market, now that's an operative word there, if we have a free market, at least it's basically free, that it will tend toward full employment and stable prices. Whereas Keynes believed that the economy could be tending toward a less than full employment equilibrium. And if it's tending toward a less than full employment equilibrium, then the solution is to shift the equilibrium to a full employment equilibrium, and we can only do that through fiscal policies. And that's what this chapter is all about. This chapter is about fiscal policies, but the Keynesians fully embraced fiscal policies of the government. Now, fiscal policies are policies of the government that they can do this or do that in order to influence the economy, hopefully to push it to full employment or maybe stable prices. And so Keynes said, yes, the classical economists are correct, but only in a special case. But here in the 1930s, now the general theory was written and published in 1936, and what Keynes said is that the conditions that existed in the 30s were such that the economy was not tending toward a full employment equilibrium, and therefore we had to shift the equilibrium, and the only way to do that is government invention via fiscal policies. So anyway, that's the background of fiscal policies. And this is contrary to the term laissez-faire. The classical economists and the Austrians basically favor laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French term which means allow them to do or leave well enough alone. So if we're having a problem in the economy, the Austrians would and the classical economists would say, well, that's just natural. We're bound to have ups and downs in the economy, so let's not get all bent out of shape, because if we just practice laissez-faire, if we just let the economy cure itself, then everything is going to ultimately be okay. So Austrians basically believe in have a laissez-faire philosophy, whereas Keynesians don't. Keynesians believe that that we ought to intervene, even in minor instances. So what happened in the Depression of 1921? This was a very serious depression, but politicians did not address the problem actively, and as a result, at least this is the way the Austrians would look at it, as a result that the economy corrected itself, and the rest of the 1920s was a period of prosperity. We call the 1920s the roaring years. It was a period of a lot of growth, a lot of inventions and innovations. It's called the Roaring 20s. And so Austrian economists look at this 1921 depression and they're saying, well, see, here's an empirical, historical example of how we have unemployment, and the government did not take an active role, and the economy did correct itself, and we did experienced a great amount of growth and in a very dynamic economy in the 1920s, and full employment, by the way. So what were policies of Herbert Hoover in the early 30s to combat the Depression? He called for public works projects, raised taxes, made loans to failing firms, and relief programs. Now, the reason I mention this is that a lot of people believe that Herbert Hoover did not take any action. He was strictly a laissez-faire type person, and consequently, the economy went from bad to worse. But historically, that's not true. Historically, Herbert Hoover was president before Franklin Roosevelt. So Herbert Hoover was president when the Depression started. Now, a lot of people look at the stock market crash in October 1929 as the beginning of the Great Depression, but the Depression really didn't really start. I mean, that was the stock market crash of October 1929 was a symptom of a problem, but not the cause of the problem. It was a symptom, but not a cause. And anyway, we'll talk about that more. But Herbert Hoover, in 1930, 1931, 1932, he actually did take an active role. In fact, when President Roosevelt was campaigning for the presidency in the early 30s, he actually campaigned against many of these interventionist policies of Herbert Hoover. Of course, when he got in office, he built on a lot of these interventionist programs and expanded it greatly with his New Deal programs of the 1930s. So you can't always believe what politicians say. They may do the opposite once they get in office. I mean, that's happened with Franklin Roosevelt. What were policies of Franklin Roosevelt, 1933, to combat the Depression, and what did I do? What did I do? Wow. You ever find that our electronic devices have a mind of their own? Does your cell phone call people just at random? All of a sudden, I hear people talk to me from my pocket, I don't know how it does that. Anyway, what were the policies of Roosevelt? Public works, raised taxes, loans to failing firms. In other words, Franklin Roosevelt expanded on the same policies of that were in place before he got into office. And of course, the 30s under the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt was a great expansion of the size of the federal government. A tremendous amount of social programs, a great amount of government intervention. That's in contrast to the way it was before the 30s. Ever larger government under Roosevelt. According to Robert Reich, an American political economist professor, what was the result of these government programs? These programs helped save American capitalism. Now, I've got someone else coming up here that says that these policies actually did great harm. And that's really the point. The point is that, some economists, especially Keynesians, look at the New Deal programs of Franklin Roosevelt, and they say, well, if it weren't for government intervention, things would have gotten a lot worse. And Robert Reich is one of them. But other authors, like Thomas Woods, for example, believe that these programs prevented the economy from seeking its equilibrium of full employment and prolonged the Depression. So we got two different viewpoints here. All right, we got two different viewpoints. Some people believe one way and some people believe another way. And so what is a fiscal policy? I mean, this whole chapter is on fiscal policy. So what is a fiscal policy? The manipulation of government purchases transfer payments, taxes, and borrowing in order to positively influence the economy. Anything that the government does to influence the economy, and of course the purpose of influencing the economy is to bring about full employment if we have unemployment, or to lower prices if we have inflation. And any action that the government takes in terms of changing tax laws, changing the level of spending, coming out with one program or another, all these things as a group are called fiscal policies. See, we've got monetary and we've got fiscal policies. Fiscal policies are policies of the federal government. Monetary policies are policies of the Federal Reserve. And now, in this chapter, we're going to talk about fiscal policies, and later we're going to talk about monetary policies. But that's, the two sets of policies, monetary policies and fiscal policies. And how did Keynes influence fiscal policies? He argued that fiscal policies may be necessary to bring about full employment. And the operative word there is may. And there is a difference, and I've mentioned this before, but there is a difference between Keynesian economics and the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. In fact, if Keynes were alive today, he may not be a Keynesian. And the reason I say that is that Keynes believed that the economy is like a person. I mean, the economy is made up of human beings, and human beings are flesh and blood, and we all have emotions, and we can all get sick. And so what Keynes said is that, normally, sickness is, for most people, is not a permanent state of affairs. Most people are healthy most of the time, but all of us get sick once in a while. And Keynes said that's the way the economy is. The economy is basically healthy, except there are times when it may become unhealthy. Now, when the economy becomes unhealthy, that means that either we have more unemployment or problems with inflation. And so what Keynes said is that when, and here's the key word, when the economy gets sick, then the government is kind of like a doctor, and the government analyzes the situation, and then it takes action to try to make the patient better. It's like a doctor comes in and takes your temperature and does some tests, and then it starts to prescribe, this medicine and that medicine, and it gives you some advice, go to bed, stay in bed for 2 days, and if you don't get better, give me a call back. And then you leave the doctor's office. And that's the way Keynes envisioned government intervention. But that's not the way Keynesians envision government intervention. The way Keynesians, modern Keynesians, envision government intervention is more of a permanent stay. It's like let's say a doctor does home visits, and the doctor comes in and says, in order for you to get well and stay well, I have to be here continually to monitor your health, and therefore I'm going to have to move in, and you're going to have to support me. Oh, and by the way, I've got a wife and 5 children, so you're going to have to support them also. Now, your house isn't big enough at this point, so you're going to have to build a big extension on your house. You're going to have to build 3 or 4, more bedrooms, a couple baths. We have to be taken care of, and so this, led to a much larger house. Well, that's kind of like the way the Keynesians have done. They've said, in order for the economy to function, without having big problems, we need government to monitor everything continually. And it's kind of like that doctor moving in for good and bringing his family, because this is all these government programs that have become entrenched into our economy. They're permanent programs, are very expensive. So the analogy of the doctor coming in and moving in and bringing his family is really a good analogy, because that's exactly what's happened. But that's not what Keynes advocated. What Keynes advocated is the doctor comes in, analyzes the economy, gives a prescription, and then leaves. The Keynesians said, well, that sounds good, except the doctor's got to stay. And that's the difference between the ideas put forth in the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936, and the modern Keynesians of today. So how did World War II affect fiscal policies? It showed that a government stimulus package can work. See, a lot of people look at the Depression and then, which was basically during the Great Depression, which was most of the 1930s. Actually, we had two depressions in the 30s, but most people look at the whole decade of the 30s as being the decade of the Great Depression, when we had 25% unemployment, and much of the other people who were working saw a great decline in their wages. One of the problems we had during the Depression was people quitting their jobs. I mean, why would someone quit their job in a depression? And the answer is that wages fell. See, prices, when you have a great deal of unemployment, prices fall, and one of the prices that fall is the price of labor. And wages fell to such a low point that people were working long hours and hardly making enough money to keep body and soul together. And so a lot of people said, this just isn't worth it, and they actually quit. I mean, that was actually a problem during the 30s. So we entered World War II, about 1941. But we started to prepare for World War II in about 1939, and this big increase in government spending Keynesians look at that and they say, well, now here's a historical proof that when the government comes in with fiscal policies, in this case it was a big deal about the war, that big increase in spending, government spending, eventually brought us to full employment. Now that would be the viewpoint of Keynesians. So what was the Employment Act of 1946? Its main purpose was to lay the responsibility of economic stability, of inflation and unemployment onto the federal government. The point here is that, and I'm going to have to look this up because I'm not sure if it was inflation. But at any rate, it was unemployment. That for the first time, the government officially said that it is the responsibility of the federal government to take action through fiscal policies when we have a problem of unemployment. See, this is what Roosevelt did in the 30s, but it wasn't an official government policy. I mean, before the 30s, and certainly before 1946, if you could go back and interview people back then, and you say, well, what is the purpose of government? Well, they would mention a lot of things that we've already talked about. Uniform system of weights and measures, and protect us against social cost, and provide us with public goods, and provide us with adequate national defense. But they would not mention that it's the responsibility of the government to take action fiscally when we have an economic problem. But that changed during the 30s, and then it was made official in 1946. See, 1946. Now we're saying, in addition to all these other things that we expect the government to do, we also expect the federal government to take action when we have unemployment. Okay. And that was the Employment Act of 1946. And so what are the four phases of the business cycle? Well, all business cycles go through the same four stages. And the bottom, which would be when we have like a depression, would be called the trough. And then ultimately something happens and things start to get better, and we call that the period of recovery. But the recovery period goes for so long. I mean, sometimes it's short, but sometimes it could be years and years. It could be very long. But eventually something's going to happen. See, when we reach what is called the peak, and then once we reach the peak, the economy starts to slide into a recession. Now, we call it a recession. You could call it a depression. So what's the difference between recessions and depressions? A recession, we can define what a recession is, but we can't define what a depression is. A recession is when gross domestic product declines for 2 or more successive quarters. In other words, a quarter is a 3-month period. So if we grow less in this 3-month period than we did the last 3-month period, and then in the next 3-month period we grow less than the present 3-month period, that's 2 successive quarters that GDP will always be positive. But if the rate of growth subsides for 2 or more successive quarters, then officially we say we are in a recession. See, that's the official definition of recession. Okay, that GDP, the rate of GDP declines for 2 or more successive quarters. Now, depression, well, the only definition of depression I've ever heard is that a recession is when your neighbor's out of work, and a depression is when you're out of work, right? It's kind of in the eyes of the beholder. It's simply recognized that a depression is worse than a recession. Now, whether we call a state of affairs a depression or recession sometimes depends on who's talking. Like if you have, take politicians who are in office, well, they're not going to talk about a depression, they're going to use the word recession because they don't want to be held responsible for something called a depression. Whereas maybe we have an upcoming election and those that are running against the incumbents may call something a depression because they want to make things sound like, hey, things are really bad and that's why you got to vote me in office. In other words, it's kind of like a personal thing. But a depression is certainly a lot worse than a recession. That's about all we can say about it. Now, in the 1930s, 25% of the workforce was unemployed. Now, full employment is when we have somewhere between 3 and 5% unemployment. Yeah, remember that, to be considered unemployed, you have to be actively seeking employment. So, what groups of people are seeking employment even in the best of times? Well, they're high school graduates, they graduate, they're looking for work. College graduates, you'll all graduate someday and you'll start looking for work. There are people who are sick of their jobs perhaps or want to advance their career and they might quit a job. There are businesses who, even the best of times, may go out of business for one reason or another. In other words, a certain percentage of the labor force will be seeking employment even in the best of times. And what percent is that? Well, somewhere between 3 and 5%. So if 3 to 5% of the workforce is unemployed, meaning that they're seeking employment, to be considered, you have to be seeking employment. It's not that, you don't have a job, but you like to have a job. Well, you're not considered unemployed unless you actively seek employment. Okay, that's the definition of being unemployed. And so if 3 to 5% of the workforce is the best and 25% unemployment is the worst, then this will give you some idea of, I've had 2 people leave now, and I really would appreciate it if you have to leave early to let me know before class. I mean, it's very rude to just get up and leave, without informing me, okay? It's just common courtesy. So anyway, where was I? If 3 to 5% is the best, 25% is the worst, then no matter what the unemployment rate is, if it's 10% or 12%, you've got some idea of how bad or good that is. That's really the point. Now, what are the 3 pillars of Keynesian economics? Okay, well, now we're going to get down into some really nitty-gritty stuff, and these are all these things were mentioned in the video I showed you at the beginning of the class. These are really 3 pillars of what makes Keynesian economics. And so we're going to look at each one. So first one is liquidity trap. What is a liquidity trap? A lack of borrowing keeps money bottled up in savings institutions. Now let me explain how this works. Money in the economy is like blood in our bodies. The economy is a living, breathing thing, and the circulation of money is dollar bills are the blood cells of that organism. Now, take your body for example. If your blood circulates too fast, then you have high blood pressure and bad things can happen. If your blood circulation is too slow, you become anemic, and of course, if it stops, you die. I mean, it's it can either extreme is bad, but it's the circulation, and of course, the way it works. That it all starts in the heart, and the heart pumps the blood cell to the lungs, and there it picks up oxygen, and then it goes to the intestinal area and picks up nutrients, and then that blood cell circulates in your body. It distributes the nutrients and the oxygen. When it's depleted of oxygen and nutrients, it begins its journey back to the heart, where that single blood cell then is pumped once again into the lung area where it picks up more oxygen. It's pumped into the intestinal area where it picks up nutrients, and then it starts its journey throughout the rest of your body, distributing these nutrients and oxygen. Now that's the way it works in our bodies. Well, this is the way that money works in the economy. Now, what is the heart in the economy? Well, the heart are banks. Our banks, people, consumers and businesses, they take money and they put the money into banks for one reason or another. And then banks pump, see, like a heart, banks pump that money out into the economy in one way or another. A common way is to lend that money out, but there are other ways that it can pump the money out. And so it pumps the money out, and then those dollars circulate. You get money, and then you buy something, and then whoever receives your money, well, they might buy something from someone else, and eventually that money gets deposited in the banking system. Of course, we're not talking about one single bank here. We're talking about the whole banking system is like a heart. Just like the heart is made up of many cells, well, the banking system is made up of many different parts, and it's even worldwide. We just saw a video on the Deutsche Bank, and it's on the verge of collapse in Europe. Well, is that going to affect us? Well, yes, it does affect us, because that's part of the heart. When I talk about the banks, I'm talking about the banking system worldwide. All right. So anyway, money goes into banks and money leaves banks. Money goes into banks, money leaves banks. And that's what it's called, the circular flow of money. Money goes in, money comes out. Money goes in, money comes out. So what is a liquidity trap? Well, the term liquidity is something that we have studied before. If your wealth is in a form that can be easily spent, then we say that you are very liquid. If your wealth is in a form that cannot be easily spent, then we say that you are less liquid or illiquid. Okay? And if you're talking about banks and the Federal Reserve, what the Federal Reserve does is that it takes action to influence the liquidity of banks. Banks are liquid when they have money above their required reserves, and therefore they have money that they can legally lend out. And the more money, cash, that banks have available that they can legally lend out, then the more liquid they are. So liquidity's got nothing to do with how much wealth there is, but what form that wealth takes. If that wealth is in a form that can be easily spent, that's liquid. If it's in a form that cannot be easily spent, like if a bank has cash but it's in required reserves, or maybe it's got wealth tied up in loans or bonds, then we say that it's less liquid. Now I had to explain all that, just explain to you what a liquidity trap is. So here's what a liquidity trap is. Let's say that I'm the banking system and you all are depositors, and you put money in my bank, either in a checking account or a savings account or a combination, and then I lend that money out. But what happens if I can't lend enough of this money out? What happens if you deposit your money in my bank, but I can't, it gets bottled up in my bank? Well, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lower interest rates. I'm going to lower the price of money, and hopefully more people will borrow that money. But what happens if I lower interest rates, as they are today, very low? What happens if I lower interest rates, but I still can't convince people to borrow money? See, the problem here is that we can't force people to borrow money. People have to voluntarily go to the bank and say, yes, I want to borrow money. Now, what happens if you put money in my bank, I lower interest rates, but I still can't find enough people to borrow this money, and this money gets bottled up in my banks? Now, that's bad for me, because I'm paying you interest on this money, or at least I'm providing a service for you, like a checking account. In other words, I have costs for this money, and if I'm not making a return on this money, well, that's a deadweight loss for me. And when this happens, that is what is called a liquidity trap. A liquidity trap is when money goes into the banking system, but it gets bottled up in that system, it gets trapped in that system, so banks remain too liquid. That's what's called a liquidity trap. This is right from Keynes's general theory of employment, interest, and money. It's a liquidity trap, all right? And then what happens is that if we put money in banks but not enough comes back out, then the circulation of money slows down, and it's just like a person who has become anemic. When your blood slows down, you become sluggish, you become very tired, and that can lead to very poor health, and it can lead to death. And that's the way it is with the economy. If money goes into savings institutions, but not enough comes back out, and it gets trapped, then eventually that could kill the economy. So, what is the solution? Well, Keynes had a solution. And this really makes a lot of sense. Even, for an Austrian, this makes a lot of sense. He says, okay, there are times when we are bound to have a liquidity trap, which means that consumers aren't borrowing enough money, investors, business people aren't borrowing enough money, So what's the solution? Well, the solution is for the government to come in and for them to borrow the money and then for them to spend it, to inject it into the economy. And that's the solution to a liquidity trap, according to John Maynard Keynes. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if we have a liquidity trap, then it may be that the only solution is for the government to come in to borrow that money and then to spend it, and therefore to rejuvenate the circular flow of money in the economy. And if that's the only problem, then that will bring us back to full health. Okay, so that's what liquidity trap is. Oh, now what did I do? Look at this. This is terrible. Okay, now what is the balanced budget multiplier? This is the second leg of the stool of Keynesian economics. The balanced budget multiplier is the belief that a dollar in the hands of the government will do more good economically than the dollar in the hands of a consumer. In fact, if you compare them, if the government has a dollar, there will be a multiple effect that does not exist if you and I have the money. And the reason is that if you and I have the money, then we will save a portion of this money. Now, savings in economics is defined as money earned but not spent. So, according to that definition, taxes is a form of saving. When you earn money and then you pay taxes with that money, well, you earned it, but you didn't spend it. So, by definition, that's savings. Now, it may be forced savings, but it is savings, you see. I mean, the definition of savings is money earned but not spent. So, if you and I have, let's say that, you all there are, part of the economy, and when you have money, then you are going to save a portion of that money. It may be forced savings, but you're going to put money in a savings account. You're going to a certain amount. You're going to do. I mean, most people save. Some more than others, but collectively, people save. Now, when the government, so what the government says is this. The government says if we have an unemployment problem, we can tax from you, we can take that dollar away, that dollar that you would have spent most of it maybe, but saved it part of it, but we're going to take that dollar away and we're going to spend it. So the multiple effect on the economy is greater because when the government has a dollar, they spend all of it, but when we have a dollar, we save a portion of it. And Keynesian economics is always geared toward demand. As long as we can manage demand, we can manage the economy. And this is what is called the balanced budget multiplier. Now, when the government balances the budget, that means that for every dollar it spends, it taxes. If it takes $1 trillion out of the economy through taxes and then spends that $1 trillion, it has balanced the budget. That's what balancing the budget means. The government spends what it takes in tax revenue. So a balanced budget multiplier, according to John Maynard Keynes, a balanced budget multiplier is that we can increase, that we can take money out of the economy, when we meaning the government can spend it, and there will be a multiple effect on the economy. This will rejuvenate demand, and therefore this will help bring us back to full employment. And that's strictly out of the general theory of employment, interest, and money. Okay, that's called the balanced budget multiplier. And the paradox of thrift is the third leg of the stool. That the more people save, the less will be demand, which leads to slow growth. Again, this is not Austrian. Austrians wouldn't agree with this, but this is Keynesian. And the paradox of thrift, now, even Keynesians recognize that the source of growth ultimately is saving and then using those savings to make investments. So some people save, they put money in bank lends it out to investors, they make good investments, that grows the economy. However, there's a paradox here, and the paradox is this. If certain individuals save, then that's one thing. But if everybody saves, that's something else. Because if everybody saves more, that means everybody will spend less, and that will lead to unemployment. Because again, Keynesian economics is always geared toward demand. So the paradox of thrift is that if people save more, if too many people save, then that will actually lead to more unemployment. And this is why Keynesians are in favor of a large government, and they're in favor of a lot of government programs. Because one of the justifications of big government and a lot of government programs is the paradox of thrift. Okay? So, now this brings us to a different point here, and this is a good place to stop. So I'll pick this up next time, and next time I've got the second part to that rap video. I think it's very well done.